Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Noel said, I'm Lynn O'Donnell. My guest is Cate Pye, and we're going to talk about Cate's special area of interest. So what I'm going to ask you to do first is elaborate on your special area of interest, and then we can go in and we're going to have a discussion for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. But first, who's Cate Pye?
So lovely to be here. Noel's given a great introduction to me. Yes, 10 years MOD and Cabinet Office as a civil servant, and then the last 15 or so, nobody's counting, right, in the private sector in consultancy. So I now lead cyber transformation and government cyber for PA Consulting, having worked also in Ernst & Young, again, in the defence and security space. So I spend a lot of my day job doing cybersecurity. One of the things that inevitably butts up against that on a regular basis is fake news, the use of social media, and how we see influence being played out across society as a whole. Because we are no longer in an age where we need another mic. Okay. We are no longer in an age where we have just government being affected by these things. The aim of anyone trying to do something against us and our society, or the West and our societies, is that they want to impact the people, the economy, the way we run our lives, and the way we operate. So it becomes very much one and the same thing.
Great. Well, let's start with defining what it is that we're talking about. It's part of the discourse, but not a lot of people really understand the real definitions of these words that we're hearing all the time. So if I just run through some of them that we've written down together, we've got misinformation, disinformation, fake news, malinformation, and even bad news. So where are we? What is it all?
What's what?
Yeah, what's what?
So it's a really good question. Bad news is bad news. It's stuff that we need to do something about. We need to respond to it appropriately. Disinformation is false information that's used deliberately or covertly, often covertly, to influence public opinion or obscure the truth. Misinformation is misleading or inaccurate, or completely false information, but
I'm good. How are you?
For that purpose. So disinformation, deliberate; misinformation, not created to be deliberately hurtful. Malinformation, often entirely fabricated and designed for malicious purposes. Fake news, which can be any of those things. News that gives a false impression, creates a false idea, reinforces things that will enable false messages to be given in the future. And there's quite a lot now of that influence piece that adds to the reinforcement, because the first time, we're all human, right? The first time you see something, you might be a bit skeptical of it. If you see it in 2 or 3 places, you tend to start believing it a bit more. So to put out information through different routes means that you can change the way people perceive that information. And because they've seen it from more than one place, it gains more credence in their minds. So those are, at a high level, the kind of different information types.
So the next thing we have to work out, once we know what it is we're dealing with, resistance is the next step. Yeah?
Yeah. And we might come back to this, I suspect, in discussion as well. There are, of course, you can try and stop people putting out misinformation. Good luck. Actually, the number of different sources, particularly now we've got social media, that you can get mal information from, is huge. And you have to be, as a defender, you have to be lucky every time to defend against it. Whereas those who are putting the information out there, misinformation out there, only have to be lucky a few times, a handful of times. But actually, this is as much about helping people understand what they need to worry about and what they don't need to worry about, and how to discern what is fake news from what is real, particularly when we've got some of those reinforcement messages going out in advance of it to to prepare the ground, if you want to think of it that way. So a lot of this is about people as well as a technological solution.
But how do you balance the subjective and the objective in whether it's fake, mal, mis, dis?
It's a good question. You can look for, does it ring true? You can look for, actually, is it sensible? I personally often look for, is it cock up or conspiracy? Usually the cock up far outweighs the conspiracy. And then use sources of media that you trust. So if you have self-selected a whole series of different news feeds on Facebook, for example, chances are there will be self-reinforcing news feeds. Look at a broad spectrum. Look at those that are trusted and have a good reputation for having checked their sources. So the broadsheets, the BBC, the national news channels, and understand what is in the mind of the person who is creating that piece of news, because the motivators of the news channel will be different depending on where they've come from. And it's quite interesting. So when you look at good fake news, it uses all the rhetoric that's been around since Plato. It uses those reinforcement techniques that legitimate media uses. And I'd be interested in your view on what the impact on the legitimate media is of fake news as well, because there's a huge dynamic there. But actually, if you're using those techniques quite legitimately, how can you help your readers identify fake news by giving them something in the legitimate news media that helps them to work that out?
But there's such a ubiquity now, isn't there? Social media is everywhere. I really don't know whether or not your average person, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, is equipped to tell the difference between fake news and legitimate news. I mean, my business is legitimate news, one hopes, has been vastly undermined by the ubiquity of fake news, misinformation, and social media has certainly helped that. So you're talking about a sophistication that people are not equipped with because they haven't been prepared to be equipped with it.
And there's certainly something, and I think Olivia will probably pick up on this in the panel, there's something around how can we educate and train our people so that everyone knows what to look out for, what to be careful of, what to be suspicious or skeptical of, because it's that healthy skepticism that means that people will be just that little bit wary of believing what's written down or acting on what's written down.
Well, you also have to understand the motivation of whoever is disseminating. So that's understanding adversaries.
Yeah.
So how do we get to that point? And maybe you can also address what are the motivations of our adversaries.
Yeah, motivations are quite interesting. So there are three key ones. Money motivates a lot of things, and I always think of these things from a cybercrime perspective as well. This is con merchants going about their business by the most effective method. I mean, don't knock it. They're business people too. They need to make a living, and this is how they choose to do it. So there's a lot of it that is about this is the cheapest route to market. They might be influencing you to buy or not buy a product. They might be influencing you to go to a certain place, and anything like that. They might be a con merchant influencing you to give them money that you're never going to see again. And so money, always an influencer. There's then the sort of internal politics. So a lot of the fake news in the USA, for example, is driven by the dynamic between North America and South America. So you'll see quite a lot of that coming from South America into North America. And it's to influence the local or regional politics or local or regional decisions. And then you've got the worldwide stuff. So this is where we see China being quite influential, both in terms of technology, economy, a whole variety of influences around IP and the perception of China and whether we want to trade with them, for example. And then also Russia, worldwide influence, usually on their specific topics of interest at that time, they tend to be much more targeted. But there are therefore those three: so money, regional or local, and then the worldwide piece.
Well, how can NATO and allies build the capacity to push back on what is clearly a very sophisticated methodology, if you like, influence methodology?
Yeah, and one of the things that we in the West have to keep in mind, and NATO, of course, is we hold up the ethics and the rule of law in a way that other parts of the world certainly don't. So where we're looking at what is effectively an asymmetric method, because it costs practically nothing to create fake news, it costs quite a lot actually to counter it. So building that reputation in NATO and the West for influencing opinion in the right kind of ways, creating the environment where we've got ethics embedded and that we are helping the users. So one of the key things in this is getting people to vote with their feet. It's a bit like, do you use Facebook? Do you use Twitter? Do you bank with a certain bank? The thing that drives those organizations is whether they have customers or not. And if people vote with their feet and go elsewhere, then that's what we want to achieve if we're moving people away from fake news channels. So there are those kind of things. And there are some interesting stats out there. So Facebook is currently taking down 1.8 billion accounts per quarter, fake accounts or created accounts. They're called by Twitter coordinated inauthentic behavior accounts. It's not called fake news. They create coordinated inauthentic behavior. It can actually be human or automated. But it's not necessarily the 1.8 billion that's the interesting number. It's that they only have 2.8 billion accounts as a whole. So the proportion that they're taking down versus what are legitimate accounts is huge. And similarly, Twitter, the Chinese movement into Hong Kong saw in one operation 150,000 enhancement accounts on Twitter, in addition to 25,000 accounts that were created to influence the opinion around that.
But we're getting into jargon again here, aren't we? Enhancement accounts. Are these bots? I mean, I have a wave every Friday. I know it's Taliban Day. Every Friday I'm attacked by a wave of bots. And I take it very personally until I open it up and it's like 3 joined yesterday, I've got 3 followers. You know, they're talking to each other, but they're attacking me. And the idea is to undermine me and my legitimacy as a journalist in this space. But I know they're bots. Is that what we're talking? Enhancement accounts is bots.
Enhancement accounts is bots.
So why can't we stick to more simplistic language? Because one of the things that I think complicates the whole space is the language that we use to describe it.
It's a really good point, and they may not just be bot accounts. So some of them will have a human being behind them, but they will be enhanced. The reason they're called enhancement accounts is they're enhancing news that comes from other areas. So they might be retweeting something, or in the case of the ones that you're talking about, they might be spotting that one is linked to something else, and then they will link in and be able to send similar messages in. So hence the word enhancement accounts. They're used to enhance or exacerbate, one might say, the messaging that's coming in via that route. But the bot question is interesting. So yes, a lot of these are automated, not as sophisticated as AI, but there's a lot of automation. And when you've got that quantity, that volume of automation, you then need to be able to use automation and to some extent AI to counter it, because you need to be able to spot what are the anomalies in behavior that mean it's not a person and an individual person with a legitimate account that is putting that messaging into the system. So spotting that behavior at that volume does need automation or technology.
But it's also key to countering it, isn't it? And a lot of this China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran is going to be state-sponsored, state-funded. And you mentioned that we come from a tradition of rule of law, also privacy, security. How do we counter that and maintain a balance between privacy that we treasure so much and the need for security, government involvement in this area?
It's a good question. The behaviours that you're looking for often in the coordinated inauthentic behaviour bucket doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go after personal information. So the privacy piece and all the benefits that gives us isn't disrupted by the fact that you're looking for a series of ways of working that tend to be either from a bot or from an individual, and it can be an individual as well, that has a deliberately malicious intent. So if you start looking for, do they tend to go for this kind of account? Do they tend to use this type of emotive language? Do they tend to focus on these geographies? You can start to pull things out that don't need personal information, but give you an indicator that that set of accounts over there should probably take a closer look.
Do we have the resources for that? I mean, you know, you mentioned the balance in what comes first, chicken or egg thing, isn't it? I mean, if I look at, for instance, the funding of terrorism, the Taliban, for instance, biggest drug dealers in the world, but the money that goes towards counter-narcotics is a drop in the ocean compared to the resources for counter-terrorism. Whereas, in my view, it should be the other way around because it's the narcotics that are funding the terrorism. Yeah. Are we looking at the same sort of dichotomy when it comes to, why is that? Glamour?
It's largely the roots of funding. So we talked about money being one of the motivators at the beginning. And that could be your standard con merchant, it could be serious and organised crime, it could be funding of terrorism, any of those things. If you're looking at who's countering it, it tends to be governments, some large organisations, but their ability to put funding into it is inevitably less than you get if you're running these scams yourself, and then it's your coffers, because you look at it as the sort of you look at the balance of investment as a serious and organised crime organisation. If I'm going to invest 5% of my money in that, and I know I'm going to get a good return on it, then I'll do that. Whereas government doesn't have the same kind of return, and it does tend to be governments that need to do the countering on behalf of their population.
And does that come back to public pressure?
There's a lot of that about it.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. If you look at the kind of things you can have fake news on, you can have fake news on pretty much anything. Yeah. It could be climate change deniers.
Yeah.
It could be anti-vaxxers. It could be somebody influencing you for or against a particular company. Most of those things don't have an easy financial price and haven't yet got to the point where there's public opinion that says to the politicians, really, we need to do something about this now.
And does that come down to public participation, demystification, simplification of the terminology, all the things we were talking about before it comes full circle?
And that demystification point is a good one. And I come across it in cyber as well as in fake news. It's not actually complicated. Yes, if you get into wiggly amps, there's some techie stuff in there. But actually, a lot of it's about behaviours. It's about what we do. It's about how we work. And it's about, as human beings, how do we interact with this thing? So having language that's easy to understand, having the ability to teach in schools. And I would say before kids have got to the age of 10, because I don't know about anybody else in this room, but by the time I was 10, I had some pretty fixed ideas about all sorts of things. So having that early on and making it okay not to know, but also giving people enough ability to go and find out whatever they need to, whatever they feel they need to know, so that they can do something different. This isn't about being afraid of it. Fake news, use of the internet, social media, this is part of our lives. It's not going away. So knowing which media you trust, knowing how to test what you're reading, all that needs to be built into our ability to understand it. And it means that we can then raise the resilience of the UK as a whole, so that whatever fake news or cyber attack or whatever it is has less impact. And that in itself can act as a deterrent. Because if you're a perpetrator, you go where you get the best bang for your buck. So if you're not going to have the impact you want, you'll do something else.
Well, you provided me earlier with an example of that, the Salisbury, the Novichok attack. Maybe go into that, what happened in the early stages and how it was counted. Yeah, so Salisbury was interesting. Those of you who missed it in the media, there was a poisoning. Who missed it?
Yeah, poisoning in Salisbury, which was perpetrated by the Russians. So almost immediately, and immediately in the Twitter sphere is within a matter of probably minutes or at most hours. Russia put out confusing messages, contradictory messages, probably some elements of the truth, because a lie always works better when it has a little truth at its heart, around how it wasn't them, and these were tourists who had a particular interest in Salisbury Cathedral.
I remember the photos. That was just precious, wasn't it?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
We didn't. So the UK gathered the evidence, got the weight of public opinion globally behind us, having gone through that process, and then came out as a global front saying, no, this is what happened. And at that point, when you've got the evidence that is strong enough to have got pretty much every other nation in the world behind you, it's sort of, okay, no, stop. And there's a saying that lies have a shorter half-life than the truth. In the case of Salisbury, that proved to be true. So our response to it was the ethical rule of law one, whereas the messaging that had come out from Russia was very much create confusion and thereby divide opinion.
But there will still always be conspiracy theorists, won't there, who will seek to, even a tiny minority who will seek to undermine whatever the truth, the accepted truth is. 9/11 is a good example of that, I think. The American government itself planted the explosives in the Twin Towers. I mean, I still meet people who think that. So there's always going to be a tiny undermining element, isn't there?
I think there is. The challenge with that now is it has greater access to put its opinions out on the world media. The internet has created an amazing way for us all to communicate and do far more than we ever thought possible. Not least when we're sitting at Zoom screens from 8 till 8 every day. But actually, it's also created an easy route for messaging that we wouldn't usually have heard. It would have been localized, or it would have been very much contained, whereas there is no way to contain that now. So again, it has to be about what are the trusted sources, what are the trusted media, and how do we encourage people to demand fact through the education that we're giving them, rather than believing the conspiracy theory or whatever it is that's come up.
So like everything, really, it comes down to the very basics of education. We'll be going into that a little bit more later on the panel, but thank you for your exposition. Maybe we could open up to questions if anybody here. There's one, hand's gone up straight away. Ewan.
Okay, I'll pass the microphone.
Thank you very much indeed. The name's Ewan Grant, as Lynn indicated, known to a number of people here. I was in the old Customs and Excise in the UK. I was the intelligence analyst for transnational organised crime, a phrase now obsolete and which needs to be subdefined, and also the ex-Soviet states. I was a member of the FCO-funded integrity initiative against Russian and increasingly Chinese disinformation, and received calls from Russian stooges in Britain, British citizens. For the benefit of anybody here who maybe have some knowledge of that, we're subject of fake news ourselves, including from Craig Murray, who's just been released from prison. The programme was planned before Salisbury. I know that for a fact. I was there. It was approved after, but it was planned before. I also used to teach in training courses in Customs and Excise the John F. Kennedy case. And I know from way back 20 years ago how it's been increasingly difficult to combat people swallowing Oliver Stone's out and out lies. He's at it again. My question is, how do you bring in the technology? What can the technology do and what can it not do, and requires the technologists working with other people, and who's particularly good at this and who's not?
So I always think of this as a kind of a bow tie shape. So we've got the sensors getting information in at one end, and that's high volume stuff. We've then got some decision made on it, and then we've got the effectors at the other end. So at the sensor end, you can do quite a lot with technology because you need its ability to rapidly get through large volumes of data, analyze the data, show you patterns and trends that the human would spot, but it would take us far, far longer. And in some cases, we probably wouldn't spot. So at that end, looking at the trends, looking at the anomalies, looking at how you can cut the data differently to get an indication of, are you seeing streams of media feed from a particular area, on a particular topic, in a particular worrying space? At the centre, so the decision maker, you need technology to display that information in a way that makes it easy to make the decisions, so that your decision makers will always be the busiest people. That's why they're the decision makers. So giving them an easily accessible set of information makes that much more effective at the centre. You've then got to the second part of your question: what can technology help you do about it? And what it can't. So it can't make that decision for you. It can give you suggestions and help. And then you can use technology to take down rogue internet sites, to flag up to particular media outlets that they are either being spoofed or that their name is being used in a way that they need to do something about. You can do that across industry as well. And the National Cybersecurity Centre introduced active cyber defence initiatives to do internet site takedown and things like that. The things that it shouldn't do at that end is anything that hasn't had that decision making in the loop. And I didn't get a chance to listen to the Reith lecture this morning, but I will do. I don't know if anybody did, because how do you use technology and how does technology begin to use itself is both really powerful and potentially takes that human decision making power out of the loop.
Aren't we seeing that already with the with algorithms?
We are seeing some of it.
Yeah.
Usually the
And
algorithm
stock trading.
Yeah, usually the algorithm is designed to have the person in the loop. With stock trading, you're right, the speed of the decision, it can be affected by a few meters of wire.
Yeah.
You need it to happen so fast. But actually, you then need to design in the algorithms and the AI to police the algorithms and AI so that you flag it up. But it can go wrong a long way really quickly because of the speed of decision making in it. So yes, absolutely.
Noel, I think you have a question from a
Yes, we
Zoomer
do.
member.
We have so many questions. I'm going to ask two on behalf of the Zoomers. Governments are legislating to force social media companies to unmask trolls. Do you think this has a realistic chance of success? It can act as a pathfinder for other Western countries to put cooperation with social media platforms on a higher level? And secondly, do we yet have bots that can detect and counter disinformation within hours, if not minutes? To what degree can the release of authoritative official data and documentation counter the conspiracy theories?
So legislation to unmask trolls. First question.
It's interesting, isn't it? Social media brings out the best and the worst in people.
Indeed, yeah.
I'm a great believer, and the views expressed today are entirely my own. I'm a great believer in, if you wouldn't say something to somebody's face, you shouldn't say it at all. So do I think trolling should be permitted, tolerated? No, I don't. I don't think we would tolerate it face to face. I don't think we should tolerate it in the internet space either. So should we legislate? Personally, I would be delighted if we legislated on that and then followed through on it, because there is legislation in place already that does some of that. Second question, I think, was around bots.
Do we have bots that can detect and counter misinformation?
Within hours or within minutes?
Within hours. So there is software that can track and counter bots. It looks for that behavior, and actually Facebook and Twitter and the sort of big social media outlets do have that some of that capability, and they do use it. Hence, we know that they've taken down 1.8 billion Facebook accounts. The software that's used to take down government kind of level threats or sort of large corporate threats is quite expensive still. It's not. Why do I think it's expensive? I think it's quite expensive because not many people have asked for it yet. Because once you get commoditization of these things, the unit cost goes down. Yeah. There are, however, cheaper solutions which tend to be used by media companies to track the impact that their messaging is having. So marketing companies, et cetera, will look at the impact of the social media. So there are a variety of things in there. Can it track it in hours and minutes? Yes, it can. Does that give us the ability to respond in hours and minutes? Probably not yet. And again, it comes back to you need to have the person in the loop. You don't want the AI to decide that it's going to do something, and then you realise that inadvertently you've shut down, I don't know, half a country. That would be awkward.
It depends on the country, really.
Well, yeah, okay, fair. And then could we release the authorised data? Yes, to some extent, it depends. It depends how we've got that and how we've managed it. Because if it's putting lives in danger, and we talked about the ability to be private online, which if you are under threat yourself and you are in a war-torn country, etc., privacy and the ability to use that, which is why a lot of the dark web has not been shut down, the ability to do that and to report either as a journalist or as a citizen from somewhere that is unsafe for you individually or where you're under threat, you don't want to be risking, you don't want to be creating those kind of risks.
Question in the room. Over here.
Hi, thank you very much. Will Robert Shaw, data engineering consultant. Just a question more about regulation and algorithms, which you kind of touched on. Given what we know about Facebook, Twitter, and their kind of algorithms around meaningful interactions, which actually just bring up, hate more than they bring up kindness, how do we look at our regulation processes as Western governments to regulate and keep up with the speed of technology that constantly evades our regulation?
It's a really good question.
It's like the speedboats, isn't it? The drug dealers have the fastest speedboats. Yeah. How do you outrun them?
And it's interesting, the legal system and the regulatory system, not just in the UK, but in the Western world, is not fast enough. We need to restructure it so that we can both respond to some of the current threats. So it's designed for an environment in which things don't change terribly quickly. We've got enough time to make a decision. It looks a bit like the last thing we did, so we can base it on some kind of case law. The world's changed. We are now dealing with things that move in minutes and hours. We need to be able to have a set of standards and guidelines, if you want to think about it that way, that we can then rapidly update. So we need to create that adaptive regulatory and legal system. And that probably means quite a significant restructuring of it.
You had a question over there? Yep.
So fake news seems to proliferate most commonly in societies where community bonds and trust is very weak or even non-existent, and the institutions are either seen as weak or non-existent as well. So is it possible, and what would the cost be in the long term, to rebuild those institutions and that frayed trust as a method of countering fake news, hopefully, over the long term?
It's a really interesting point. And it's one of the things, actually, I don't know about you, but I worried about as we went into lockdown for COVID, because as soon as you take people away from each other, they don't understand each other so well. So people were equating it to, oh, this is like the Blitz. No, it wasn't. In the Blitz, everybody was in it together, mostly in the tunnels under London. And yes, the threat to life and limb, it brought people together. What we did at the beginning of lockdown was create little pockets and say, oh, and by the way, you can't actually go and talk to anybody else. You can't go and talk. And we saw even then the beginnings of dissent between different groups and suspicion. Humans are pack animals. We will naturally find our own little pack and tribe. And if encouraged, we will then go and talk to other packs and tribes. So I think that community piece and enabling communities to trust each other, because this is all about trust. Who do you trust? Actually, I trust people I know, and I will ring them up and say, seen this on BBC or CNN or whatever. What do you think? Does it ring true? If you haven't got that community and that network to talk to, then your checks and balances change. And we all know of times in our lives when we've kind of sat there and thought too much about something and then decided that maybe that was actually true or all right or whatever. And it probably still wasn't. We should just have compared notes more widely. So I think that how can we create that community? A lot of it starts in the education system. A lot of it, and you talked about institutions as well, a lot of it is around, is there a strong, not dictatorial, institution that we can draw on and build that level of trust from? So I think that's really important and a key way to start countering some of the fake news messaging.
Okay, if I could ask a couple of questions from our Zoom audience. One is, do you think the general public as a whole care enough about fake news to distinguish between what is real and what is fake? And possibly along the same lines, but possibly also a little bit scary, is fake information being most interesting to the public if it actually directly affects them? So a financial scam captures their attention, but other fake information just flows over them.
The implication being that that information that flows over people is unaccountable and therefore gains traction. Do you want to go with that one first and we'll get back to the first question?
Yeah, I think that they are, because the first one, if it's a straight question, do the public care enough? Well, the answer is no, not yet. Is it, if it's a question of do they care about what's relevant to them? Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would say yes, they only care about what's relevant to them or to people that they know and care about, because otherwise we would be taking in so many pieces of information and news feeds on a daily basis that we would as human beings be swamped. So our natural way of thinking is to focus on the things that we know are relevant to us. And we have a rapid filtering system in our brain that does that. Anyone who hasn't read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a good read. And it will explain how the brain works, how we filter stuff down, because otherwise there is just too much out there. So yeah, I think we focus only on the things that we perceive as currently relevant to us.
Mm. Yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking about that.
Okay.
Elizabeth.
Thanks very much, Kate. Elizabeth Negus here. The fake news is, rising at an exponential rate. We literally can't keep up with that. As far as education is concerned, the majority of students on campus, they're grappling with it. And research shows that they're not well equipped to distinguish between fake and what's real. Now, the rate at which the fake news is rising, eclipses how much truth we can cope with. Do you see a time, hopefully in the near future, when there will be an imbalance where real news and trust will be at the head? Because if not, we are heading for collusion. Thank you.
That's a really good question.
It comes down to the education issue. I mean, it touches on the previous questions. It's
Yeah.
all about education.
And you're right, Elizabeth, that there will only ever be more information. There will only ever be more fake news. So we need to kind of flip it on its head and make sure that our filtering mechanism is better honed. And it may be that some of the mechanisms for that are, well, these are the trusted news media that have a kite mark from the government.
Like a wool mark.
Exactly. It may be that these are the things to look out for. And we've seen, it's so sophisticated now. And the ability of AI, for example, we were looking when we did research for this, we were looking at AI generated images, faces, and you know what? They all look pretty real to me. So you can generate it much faster than you can counter it. So we accept that we're not going to be able to counter it. We need to build in the mechanisms that it becomes less effective.
But also getting back to the previous question, people only caring about what is important to them, it's imperative, isn't it, to make the whole spectrum of this technology important to everybody.
Or enough people that it's properly invested in.
Yeah, and you have to start that early, as you said. Yeah. Question from the floor. Oh, quite a few. This lady here.
Hi. My name is Ava. I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow up at the University of Bradford. I just wanted to know, just following on from that point, are there any examples of initiatives that are being run to sort of mitigate the salience of fake news in individuals, and that you can think of? And if so, how do you measure that?
Measurement is we're writing an article on the back of this as well. The conversation I was having with colleagues this morning is, how do you measure that? Because actually are there initiatives going on around how to counter this? Yes, various experiments looking at so some of the things that Twitter and Facebook are doing are very good. There's work at the NATO Centre in Latvia, which is looking at it and identifying where news feeds, for example, on NATO come from, 84% from Russia, in case anyone wants to know. And there are therefore sort of a variety of information points that are coming out. The key, as you suggested, with how do you measure it, and nobody quite knows the answer yet, is what's the baseline? And then what are those indicators you're looking for? Are you looking for because you want to look at the outcomes, not just the inputs. So if there is a series of media messaging on a particular topic, do you see a change in public opinion? And can you measure that through an Ipsos Mori poll or something like that? If you see a series of government media messages around how bad sugar is for you, do you see a change in behaviour around buying of sugary drinks? Or do you only see that change in behaviour once they've put the tax up on sugary drinks? I think we know the answer to that one. So there are a few things there that you can start looking for and seeing, am I actually seeing a change in the behaviour of the audience, or a change in the click-throughs, or a change in the media feeds that they choose to take? So there are a few things that you can track like that, but getting that end effect measure is really difficult.
Okay.
Zoom question coming.
If I can tell you, you have too many Zoom questions, but
Never have too many.
no
Zoom
many.
questions.
What sort of oversight can we hope from government to also ensure that governments don't misuse or misinform? And also, another strong question, Cate, can you give other personal examples of countering propaganda like the Novichok affair? So nothing like throwing the ball and seeing where it lands.
Thanks, Noel. The oversight question really cuts to the balance of power, doesn't it, between the need for security and government intervention into the private space?
Yeah, it does. So what oversight can government give? There is, of course, having that view of what are we seeing in the media, and making sure that where there is disinformation coming out that is at a government level, there is a clear response to it. Salisbury was a good example of that. What do we need to do to make sure that the right limits are put on government power in that sense? And there was a question earlier, should trolling be regulated against? I think it should. Some people would say it shouldn't because that's government overstepping the mark. And you will get a different tolerance depending on culturally what each country is comfortable with around the level of intervention it will accept. I would argue that we've accepted a huge amount of intervention as we've gone through the course of COVID. That if you told any of us 3 years ago we'd be doing that, we would all have laughed. But actually, if you're looking at what will a country like Britain accept, it will be a different level of intervention and regulation, usually lower than somewhere like Singapore, for example. And it will be a different type of intervention to somewhere like Sweden. So it really does have to be culturally based and respond very much to what the public in the country will accept and respond well to. Because this is not about just what government is going to do as an intervention. This is about the response you want and the behavioural change you want in the audience. And that's us. That's the whole of the population. So what change do we want in behaviour? What do we and every other government need to do to change that behaviour to achieve what we want? It's a bit like when you're trying to put a message across to any audience. It doesn't matter what you say. It matters what they hear and what they do differently as a result. Are there any other examples? None that spring instantly to mind, so I'm not going to try and bluff too hard on that. But there are some interesting stats that I pulled out earlier. And anyone who wants to look for more, go to the Oxford University Programme on Democracy and Technology, DemTech, who've done a compre-propaganda study. So 70 nations use fake news and info ops. 7 use it on a targeted and regular basis. And the ones that the study found were Russia, China, Venezuela, Saudi, India, Iran, and Pakistan.
Most of the usual suspects.
Most of the ones that you would probably expect. So if you're looking at is this something that is broadly done and broadly used? 70 nations, that's quite a few. How can we help to counter that? We can set the expectation in the population that they should be skeptical of some of these new feeds. They should be looking for not necessarily what they are expecting to see, but something that is sensible and makes sense. And that where there are inputs from countries that you would expect to be having a particular point of view, or organisations, news organisations that you would expect to have a particular point of view, if that's what you're expecting to see, don't be surprised to see it.
Indeed. I think we have some more hands that were up before, down the back there. Thank you very much. And then maybe we can take 2 questions, because the gentleman in front of you also wants to ask a
Thank you, Marshall Kent. Is there a limit, or is it unlimited threat from groups like QAnon in bringing down Western democracies? The US has a number of senators who are QAnon advocates, so they are elected people. What is is there a limit to that particular threat against Western democracy?
And just, my name's Simon, I'm studying at SOAS. Very quick question, it was really around the instance of troll farms, to your point, Lynn, you know, Taliban Friday, I think you called it. But the question really is for Cate around what's the proportion of troll farms relative, or AI farms, if you like, relative to the standard kind of blogging crackpot that might be trying to just push their own agenda.
Thanks, gentlemen. Is there a limit to the threat from groups like QAnon that are very powerful? They really do get their message across. And there are some estimates that 80 million people in the United States are adhered to the QAnon message. Frightening.
Frightening. I don't think there will ever be a limit to that. We will always have people who have their own opinions. Whether we agree with them or not, that's the beauty of free speech and free thought. And I suspect most of us would argue more strongly for it than against it. Free speech and free thought, that is. So I think that we need to set up our systems to be able to cope with it. If it's not one particular idea, QAnon or whatever it is, it will be the next one. So as we know, democracy is the least worst solution, but it's the least worst solution. So we need to make sure that it continues to work and set up our system so that we can adapt to whatever the pressures on it are from today and for tomorrow. Troll farms, I don't know the stats, Simon, I'm sorry, but given there are 2.8 billion true Facebook accounts, and they take down every quarter 1.8 billion Facebook accounts, that tells me that the majority of it is, so I think of it as hub and spoke. In reality, you will have a hub at the center that is human controlled and led and sort of sets the things up. And then and then you'll have the bot accounts that are repeater accounts, enhancement accounts. They exacerbate and promulgate the message. So I don't know whether it's a particularly troll account, but my back of the envelope calculation would be significantly more are automated. And if you look at the Hong Kong example, 150,000 bot enhancement accounts. Probably not all bots, but let's assume most of them were, versus 25,000 human accounts.
I think we have time for one more Zoomer-innerer.
Okay, I think it's the ultimate question. Should NATO go offensive with disinformation to destabilise our adversaries? Given that somebody also asked, if governments and big pharma and corporations lie, how can we trust you today?
It's a good question. I go back to there is an ethical and rule of law element for NATO and the West to uphold. There is a need to make sure that the information that is being given out, whether we are in conflict, whether we are sub-threshold, or whether we are just going about our daily business, creates the environment that we need it to create. So should NATO go offensive, if we are in a conflict situation, I think there is a need to get the right information out there in the right way.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. That's a drawing to the end of this session. I hope it's been edifying. It certainly has been for me. Thank you so much for your time, Kate. And thanks for being here. Let's give her a